Catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.
Welcome to Tony's Tech Side, another episode of Tony's Tech Side, but this is a special one because it is on COP28 and the things that have shaped the conversations around climate change and its discussions on the continent in 2023. Before COP28, COP, by the way, is Conference of Parties 28, and I have a couple of episodes on COP27 and the COPs before, and also on climate change and other areas that concerns climate change, previous episodes. So before COP28 in 2023, it never really felt like Africa really crystallized its internal consultations in a coordinated manner. I may be wrong, maybe I hadn't noticed, but well, I stand to be corrected. On the road to COP28, stakeholders in Africa held 6, perspectives to climate change discussions, from renewable energy to climate adaptation, climate finance, loss and damage fund, energy justice, and climate change research. Now, with COP28 ending in Dubai in December 2023, how did we fare? How have we fared? Were we able to make any progress with our plans? Well, notice that Africa held consultations and meetings which somehow crystallized into a forum or a conference which held in Nairobi earlier in 2023, just before the Conference of Parties happened in Dubai from November to December. I have 2 wonderful guests with me. Yes. First is Odirilwe Selomane, and second is Olumide Idowu. Odirilwe is South African and Olumide is Nigerian. They would spend about a few seconds or minutes to tell us a bit about themselves, and then we would go straight up into the conversation. Let's start with Olumide and then Odirilwe.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to part of this conversation. My name is Olumide Idowu. I'm from Nigeria. I'm the Executive Director for International Climate Change Development Initiative, an organization that is trying to build a climate smart generation across Africa. And we are just here to, shift the narrative and change the narrative of people about the conversation on climate change, and also to bridge the gap between the government and the local communities. So that is a little bit about me and what I do and my organization. Thank you very much.
Beautiful. Thank you, Olumide. And Udi?
Thanks, Anthony, for inviting me. My name is Odirilwe Selomane. I work as a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria, and I'm also a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So this is a platform that discusses biodiversity in the same way that IPCC discusses climate change.
Okay, interesting. Now, if we start with the trends we noticed that shaped climate change discussions in 2023, what would you say you noticed? Odirilwe and Olumide. Udi first.
Yeah, so I think the conversation is, when you think globally, is quite different on what the priorities are. And if you look at continents like ours, Africa, there's a strong winds of shift, I think, in some corners where the continent is trying to recast itself from a receiver of finances and aid, but also to position itself as a full participant that brings solutions to the table as well. And there has been some interesting developments in this regard, of course. But one of the, I suppose, the key issues that is quite important here for us as a continent has been climate adaptation. And obviously the discussions at COP this year were not very satisfactory when it comes to adaptation. But that is one key area that is critical for Africa as a continent, I would say.
Okay. Olumide, what do you think? What are your own thoughts around what shapes the conversations we're having this year, 2023?
Yeah, thank you. I think what Odiri said is just what I think, because you are African. And for me, I think one of the biggest things that I quickly want to share is when you look at the AGN, what is the voices of the AGN concerning Africa? And looking at adaptation as a strong message for Africa. also shows to us that we also need much more financial support to help vulnerable people to adapt to the impact of climate breakdown. So it's very key that the issue of adaptation have been a very big conversation more than the issue of mitigation. And just because of what African is clamoring for, looking at the Indian statement, we also look at the area of how the clear priority that COP28 has actually brings to the people of Africa. We are looking at an ambitious decision that under the work program on just transition pathways that operationalize, equiting the pathway for adaptation, finance, and mitigation. And if you look back to the Paris Agreement, it's cognizant that the continent's unique needs and the circumstances that we see now is that adaptation is very strong need for Africa. And this issue, we need to actually ensure to make sure that this ensure a fair and equitable shift to a low carbon and climate resilience development. So I think that's one of the focus area that's shaping the conversation. And when we are going deeper, maybe we're going to be talking more about what those tests looks like during the outcome of COP28. Thank you.
Yes, you were just about to get to that. Now, in terms of the major things that we're focusing on, especially from the Nairobi document, the document that we crystallized in Nairobi, do you think we had a fair outing? And were the ambitions we had, were they at any point in time, based on the documents, from COP28, did we make a headway? Olumide?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would say that we pushed not, if I put it on the scale of 1 to 10, I would say like 4/10. Why? Because I think the preparation from African Climate Week was not really, maybe it did not really get some African countries ready for COP28. Majorly because some of them did not actually, take part in the, in the aggregation and decision that was actually, made. If you look at the issue of enhancing mitigation ambition and even implementation by developed countries, developed countries, do they actually scale up their mitigation action and provide necessary support to developing countries to contribute their fair share of climate action? Do they do that? Were they able to enhance supports that provide developing countries to implement our ambition national determined contribution in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication? So the African Climate Week is supposed to have been a bedrock that break, the need of African continent. And let me quickly also share that if you look at the preparation for COP28, we have two different meetings at the same time: the African Climate Summit and the African Climate Week, which the messaging was actually, I would not say contradict each other, but we're trying to establish something. And the AGN was also, their priority is supposed to go along with countries' negotiation. So, with developed countries, do they even provide financing and facilitate investment that is needed for just transition pathway? So there are a lot of messaging or a lot of questions, because when you see the outcome of COP28, you're able to understand that the AGN, the African Group of Negotiators, actually need to look at the need for different countries critically before coming up with a decision on behalf of so many vulnerable people across Africa. But I will say that we've gotten a certain fair share for this conference because they've made a commitment, but the implementation is now the problem. Thank you.
Udi, do you feel the same, like the same way Olumide feels?
Yeah, I think Olumide really articulated this very well. So rather than try to make the same point, which I think he covered much better than I can, is to maybe raise another issue that's related to this, which is that the agreements that are being taken in this sort of big meetings, these global meetings, in the regional ones, are speaking at the level that is, if I can say, somewhat unenforceable. And what's really happening on the ground, as we've seen with the, I think one really good example that concerns me, and of course not the only one, it's the buying up of land the size of the UK in Africa over the last few months by a company called Blue Carbon. And this is a concern for me because in the spirit of climate solutions, land has been grabbed and taken away from the continent. And so while those discussions are happening at that level, and they're moving a little very slowly, I think to quite well, the 4 out of 10 effort there. The actions that are happening on the ground are in some ways creating a different kind of problem, in my view, of taking land away in sort of what other people have called land grabs. So I worry about what does negotiations match up with the actions on the ground. Sorry, that doesn't really quite answer your question. Just thought it's on a different.
So every day, even those that decide or decided before now, do want to see the impacts of climate change draw, closer and closer and closer. Every day, everyone seems to be like, their eyes seems to be much more open, and it seems like, oh wow, yes, actually, oh yes. And the amount of funding that would be needed or required based on, research that's been done, would be over $2 trillion. Climate financing, how did we fare this year? And what more needs to be done? Udi?
I think one telling example is, I suppose, is the loss and damage fund that was pledged for that, which is I think it's about $400 million.
Yeah.
It's a step in the right direction, but I think it's relatively small compared to what would possibly be needed. But of course, the recognition that this is a thing that money needs to be put next to is a step in the right direction. But by no means anywhere near what's needed. In the same way, I think the conversation, I think one really big outcome around financing is that there's a lot of readiness for financing of mitigation options or strategies, and clearly very little about financing on climate adaptation side. So that also tells you priorities about where the money comes from and what it's trying to fulfill. So I think unless there is money available for adaptation itself, it's going to be very difficult to make the case that we have succeeded in raising the required financing. And maybe to give another specific example, is a specific case of South Africa here, where I think about $11 billion has been pledged for the energy transition in the country. Well, it's actually not $11 billion. I'm confusing my numbers. It's either $11 billion or 11 billion rand, probably 11 billion rand. And what's needed out of that, I think might be something like 8 times that amount that's pledged. So that gives you an idea that, of course, not all of this will be solved at once. So we need to start somewhere with this money. The question is whether subsequent financing would be able to be raised to continue this project of transitioning out of fossil fuels, for example.
Okay, South Africa, close to 100, I think about $100 billion. But I think we've literally just almost 10 billion or so. That's what has been gotten. So if we look at financing from where the money is coming from and the way we're trying to raise the money, should we be thinking differently? I say this because we hear things like carbon credits, and we hear a lot of announcements, but they're not exactly direct. And I was speaking to someone, an African who stays in Switzerland, a climate activist, and he said something about, before, these monies actually get to, do the good they're supposed to do, a lot of it goes, through consultancy fees and, and whatnot. What are your thoughts around how we're raising these monies or these funding, and what would you suggest? Udi, this is a follow-up, and then Olumide, I want you to also take this up.
Right, yeah, that's a really good question, and I think I was just in discussion recently with someone who works in carbon markets specifically. One of the key issues there is that obviously you can think about, in a way, to simplify the story, 3 types of solutions, if we can call them that, or let's say approaches. One is focusing on economically viable solutions or approaches. In this case, somebody pays for something, invest in a renewable energy project, but then they can earn their money back, so to speak. So that story. And then you have another set of approaches that are focusing on sort of projects that would need some intervention in the form of subsidies to get them going. So if you think about some initial investment by government or public sector that first invest in the initial R&D to get the product or approach viable. So you have set of sort of projects or interventions like that are tricky to find, because this is where we start to look outside of the continent, outside of the most of the countries that don't have the finances to do so. And then a third one is one that there's projects or interventions that are not economically viable. They simply don't have. It's actually not about economic viability, but it's about you can't put a price on them. And think about protected areas as an example of the kind of project we're talking about. Uh-huh. So if we're trying to increase carbon sinks, let's say using land or AFOLU sectors, most of these lands, most of these ecosystems you need to be looking at are not something you're going to sell afterwards. So the sole purpose of investing money in those is specifically to keep the carbon on the ground. So if you think about these three things, then you can think about what sort of incentives do you have for different investor types to be involved. At the moment, I would say it's very cumbersome to get people to the process of verifying whether an intervention has improved carbon stocks to finally make the case for someone to end up investing on. That process is very, very difficult at the moment. It needs to be simplified a lot more for the carbon credits crediting system, which of course has its own issues, but it's a potential market that's developing. But the biggest issue, in my view, is the cumbersomeness of developing a project and eventually getting it on the carbon markets.
Okay, so this takes me to research, but let's just let's slow down a bit. Olumide, what do you think about this?
Yes, I've been waiting to say like some key words.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Akoto. For me, I don't like talking too much about this issue of finance, but let me quickly take you back. You remember very well that the crucial means of implementation of climate ambition for developed nations should be substantial financial commitment, and this need to address the outstanding issue of the promise. I'm very sure we know about the promise of the 100 billion per year since 2020. And we need to also remember that is there any effort that have been met concerning these financial needs? Now we are talking about USD in trillion. It was in billion before. Can all developed countries scale up access to climate finance for adaptation genuinely to deliver not only African countries but developing countries through grants? And if you look at it must we be looking at new funding when the one promise was not met or meet? So it's something that is critical for us to understand. Even though we welcome the pledge and the commitment of climate finance to the Green Climate Fund, to Adaptation Fund, even the less developed countries fund, we also, with this concluding conference, we also talk about the Special Climate Fund. So this commitment fall far short, of the expected scales of fund that we're looking for. None of them have actually met some of the needs of the issue of climate finance mechanisms. We also need, you mentioned something about carbon markets. We need to caution against this promotion of carbon markets, because for climate finance and mitigation action has been captured under the pillar that we talk about delivering high integrity carbon markets. To me, as for African continent, is still a false solution, and they make a declaration on global climate finance framework. So we just need to understand that this climate finance is looking at the issue of loss and damage, is looking at the issue of adaptation, is also focusing on mitigation. So how do we keep promises that meet implementation, so that we don't keep saying the same thing somebody mentioned it. Can we just stop going to COP? Can we just stop COP to every 5 years, so that we don't waste resources in going to the same conference and coming up with one line agenda to add to the last year, So it is very, very important that the issue of climate finance is key, because the aim of going for COP or for the agreement or for negotiation is for them to reduce their emission. Even if you look at it very well, under the fossil fuel issue, that all of us, we are shouting that, oh, now we've met this. This is the first time in 3 decades of climate negotiation that the word fossil fuel have been made it into the COP28 COP outcome. Now we are finally naming we call it the elephant in the room, because fossil fuel is the elephant in the conversation. So are we trying to be genuine with this statement? Because the bottom line is, where do we get money now to get the alternative? So how do we look at the future COPs that we only turn us to talk about the issue of reducing the dirty energy as well? So there's a lot of, action. There's a lot of points that we need to be very cautious about when it comes to the issue of from billion to trillion. Thank you.
Can I say something quickly, Anthony?
Yeah, sure. It's a conversation.
Yeah. So Olumide, I like that you have a very strong feeling about finance and how it should go. So I just wanted to say a couple of things about. So one of the things I want to say is that most of the, again, using the example of the Just Transition in South Africa pledges, I think about 75% of the money pledged is loans. So very little of it is grants. So and I don't think that proportion changing too much in my view. I know it should, but so
realistically, right?
I have realistically. So I have in some ways, I think the public sector pledges have some restrictions in terms of how they are operating at the moment. And also they have some limitations in terms of how much they can grow. So I think there's a real case for private sector financing to come into play. And we should be exploring, and I know there's a lot of controversies around carbon markets, but we should be exploring what are the alternative ways this can work, given what we know about our continent. What sort of experiments can we put on the ground to see? And most important to think about, is there an opportunity to use mitigation financing to fund adaptation? I don't know how that works in practice yet, but I think these are some of the questions we should be innovating around in terms of, given the current flows of funding into the continent and the conditions that come attached to it, what are the other ways we should be thinking about financing? And what are some of the innovative ways we could inform the world about how that financing could look like here? Which is, in some ways, it could be through market instruments, but also through public instruments as well. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Olumide, any counter thoughts? Any comments?
Yeah, I think that was very articulate. Thank you so much.
Okay, now let's look at Olumide mentioned alternatives, and we know that we have like abundant hydro, solar, wind, and other bioenergy resources for us to rely on, and to be reliant mainly on fossil fuels. Renewable energy, just about 18% or so of the energy mix on the continent. What are your thoughts around this? From renewable energy, of course, you talk about just transition, and all of that. What are your thoughts about how we're developing innovative solutions internally, like locally, to help push us faster, on the transition? Udi and Olumide.
Yeah, I fully agree with you that the resources are plentiful, renewable energy resources. It's a tricky one here, I think, because without having done the research into this particular topic, I can't speak more confidently than half speculation, I suppose, which is that in some ways there's this air of hope that, we will discover again, we'll discover this, we'll discover that. So this waiting of fossil fuels to be discovered, which I think in some ways are tainting how we could be thinking about innovation in other alternative sources. Over time, we know that renewable energy are much, much cheaper. As far as I'm aware, we're not doing enough research, R&D, in terms of exploring how we could develop Africa developed solutions for renewable energy. The technology is there, can be learned from, can be developed, can be manufactured. And of course, you can make a case about the lack of capital to get those going. Besides capital, I think that, in my view, there doesn't seem to be enough focus of this as a real solution. But like I said, this is based on very little information that I would take what I'm saying with a bit of grain of salt, and I hope Olumide can provide a much more educated answer to your question.
Yes, before Olumide comments, how much more do we need to do in the area of research? Because I don't. You're in the space, right? How much data is available? How much research is available? Not just about the problem, but maybe possible ways to go around thinking about the problem and the solutions. Udi?
So some of the common ways that, I suppose, one of the early criticisms was always that renewable energy are expensive, but of course over time they've gotten much cheaper than fossil fuels. And the other issue was the reliance on imported technology, for which we don't have technical ability to maintain. So this has been quite a critical issue, that once you have this technology imported and set up, you need a lot of maintenance to keep it going. Who does the maintenance? And so this is a critical issue. I think the training in that sense are about technicians who can maintain that kind of technology, because all technology needs to be maintained. And I think we know very well from deteriorating infrastructure on the continent that maintenance is a critical aspect, which if you neglect, you end up with infrastructure that's falling apart. So I think that's one other area of how are we training people to be able to embrace this on the one side, and how well are we studying these existing technologies in a way that people on the continent know about them, know how to develop them, and ultimately also know how to maintain them.
And since you're into research, which areas should we be focusing more attention on? Mitigation, and where should we put in our money in research or efforts in research on the continent?
And in some strange way, you could say, forget mitigation. Okay. Not forget mitigation per se, but and I'll explain what I mean by this. What I mean is, as a continent, there's a massive need for energy. So even if you forget about whether you're doing it for climate reasons, you're doing it for energy provision, that could be your motivation. We need to be providing energy to millions and millions of people on the continent.
True.
And if you're going to do it now, why not use renewable energy, basically? So that's. I think there's been a research. I don't know how extensive it is on the areas of potential renewable energy that offers the most. So we should be researching those potential areas on what are they suitable for what kind of technology, and how well can we develop the storage capacities to, because I think one of the criticisms that people all talk about is the space flow idea, that how do you maintain electricity flow when the sources of energy are not able to provide it at that moment. So you need to be able to store that when for example, your wind turbines are not running. And so I think an exploration into those kinds of questions about, we know the technology works, we don't know how to store it in a useful way yet. So can we research that? Can we get people working on that to just stuff out? As an example.
Oh, okay. Olumide, would you want to comment on one of the thoughts that have been shared already by Udi?
Yeah. Let me say the last key 3 or 4 points of Udi was actually something that when you said how much more do we need, is it mitigation? For me, Africa need a lot of adaptation. And just so we know that we are not saying that we don't need mitigation, but technology-wise, are we ready? Is the opportunities are there, but getting it done or putting it in perspective of how do we drive this innovation lies within Africa and exist. So the issue of moving from fossil fuel to renewables is a conversation of how are we ready to follow up through this transition. Let me give you an instance. We are clamoring, we are calling, we call it special needs, we call it circumstances for Africa. How do we as an African actually, maximize the potential of our natural resources that can give us the resources that we need, even though we want the polluters to pay? So it is important we look at adaptation as one of our strong way. We're talking about just transition. How much have we recognized that just transition are for all countries, and for us to recognize the significant needs and special circumstances of developing country parties? Because if all parties are not speaking in one voice, I don't know that maybe if I say it again, that there's this conversation online that Zambia is saying something else, and they are the AGN, African government, and there's another people saying something else. How do you think Africans need to come together and think about this issue of renewable energy as an alternative? Because if you come to Nigeria as an example, that our alternative is gas. How much have we even invested in that gas? How much the country, how many of our people in the vulnerable communities have access to that? We need to decide, the kind of programs, that can help our just transition pathways to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. I'm sure you've read the Article 2, Paragraph 1. Paragraph 1, Article 2, Paragraph 2. All this text speaks on just and equitable transition, which encompasses pathways that include energy, social economy, workforce, and other dimensions, all of which must be based on the nationally defined development priorities. So if we are talking as a country or as a continent, and we are looking at renewables, we're moving from fossil fuel to renewable, how much are we ready? How much do we follow up? How much do we make sure that there are international cooperation as an enabler, of just transition pathway towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement? How much are we leveraging on that? So what is our message? What is the language that we use in speaking during our negotiation? So it's a big area of conversation that Africa as a continent need to be ready, and we need to welcome the just transition work program of the just transition pathway that we all are talking about, so that the design of the comprehensive program can also help us to insist on our funding approach, so that we'll be able to understand what do we need the funding for. Most of people say our projects are not bankable. Beyond international cooperation, how do we make sure that we have solid content that can attract fund, that can make them to see the need for them to inject funding into? And we also need to look at we need to clarify how we discuss the issue of transition in sectors wide, because we have different sectors. Look at our national economic contribution in Nigeria. We have the 7 sectors. How are we looking at this so that it can be fair, it can be gender responsive, and it can be equitable for all? So we need to look at all these things with very deep attention, and we should not forget that there's also political realities from different regions, different nations, and different continents, and the way we see it from the point of climate justice. So for me, I just see that every other thing, all these things we are talking about is possible, but implementation, our readiness, our approach, and how do we make sure that we have solid opportunities on ground? How do we refer to case studies that can make them to know that we need to bring back our land that have been taken away, and we need to do more investments, bring more investment opportunity for the interest of the people and the planet. Thank you.
Very interesting questions raised. If I knew these, like the answers to these questions, I would almost likely be like the happiest person, because I almost like I saved the world, to a great extent. Now, if we take a look at the amount of funding that has been spent on wars, just say in the last 2 to 3 years, over $2 trillion, from the Russia-Ukraine to the Israel-Palestine or Hamas to the ones here on the continent. We've spent a whole lot of money already on, I just mentioned those two because, in terms of where the funding is coming from, or the backing financially, I would say is also from those who have made pledges, and are supposed to be, like meeting up with these pledges and the announcements. But then let's look at our involvement in the different COPs. Olumide, do you want to make a comment on this?
Different COPs are based on the money that we've gotten for. Well, I think I've mentioned that I was able to have the opportunity to be at COP28. Yes, that was during the Paris Agreement 2015. Let me say that if we go back and check all the articles under the Paris Agreement, we should know by now that we've gotten a platform to ask, to request, and to demand. And that's what we have been doing. Then flashback to 2019. Then the promise, like the way we are talking about, there is a sort of outcome for fossil fuel. We have the same outcome on climate finance in 2019 in Spain, when they pledged $100 million, right? Yearly. But beyond, where is the money? How many people have been able to access this fund? Even the Global Climate Fund, the Small Grant Program, the JEF, all this funding are part of the kind of financial mechanism we're talking about. So how many of the countries, except some civil society organizations that have been able to access some funding for local actions, but how many countries, when it comes to country specific, have been able to access some certain amount of money to meet the adaptation program, to meet the energy issue, to solve the problem of mitigation? So we need to, I don't think we've seen response to some set of commitments that have been made. So if we cannot see that, then how are we sure that the global stock take will take its right foot now? That the fossil fuel that they are telling us as a very big ambitious commitment in COP28, how are we sure by next year we are not going to be speaking the same word, the same language to the same people at the same time, and be seeking for the same funds for the same project?
So Olumide, I wouldn't want to cut you short, but I'm posing your question, back at you. I'm asking you the same question you asked when you were talking a while ago. Should we continue? Should African countries, delegates continue to attend COP?
Yes. In my own opinion, we should. But is it possible for us to limit it yearly? Why I'm saying this is because I would not say the scale of 1 to 10, we are getting 4/10 in every commitment, every statement. The process of inclusion, how does it reflect the outcome of the negotiation in Paris at COP21, where the African ministers requested the French presidency to undertake consultation on the issue of vulnerability of Africa? This is another COP. What has changed? What has happened? So I think we should strategize the people that attend COP. We should strategize the people that negotiate for Africa. And we need to work closely with the African group of negotiators so that they can put another fight to have these issues, including as official agenda item of COP28, in consultation under the COP28 presidency, or looking at the further presidency that we need to have moving forward, to have such reflection whether what we are even doing in COP every year is actually reflecting back to each country in the developing countries. So we need to review that. So for me, I think we should sit down and look at whether COP, for me, I think COP should not be, it's just like General Assembly in the United Nations Environment Program. It's every 2 years. So can we look at that as well, so that we don't keep spending money that we're supposed to use to develop our country, so that we don't continue to have wrong people at the wrong table negotiating on our behalf. So that's my point.
So now you've mentioned the persons who attend. There was a bit of a news that went around when Nigeria attended, something around over 1,000 delegates from Nigeria attending, and then later on about over 500. What caliber persons, what kind of persons should African countries be sending to COP, if at all we're attending COP, like you suggested, at intervals, not every year, but maybe, once in 2 years, once in 5 years, whatever is decided? And do you have any comments on the news that broke about the number of persons that actually attended COP from Nigeria?
Yeah, thank you very much. I was one of the people that was getting the back and forth.
Interesting.
But let me quickly make this known to you that people don't understand the COP processes, and every industry must look at climate change as a big issue. And that's where you see the entertainment industry, you see the even sports. Everybody's using every kind of an avenue to propagate the gospel of climate change. And when you look at the delegation that Nigeria took to COP, people need to sit down and do the analysis. There are civil society organizations, there are government agencies, there are private sectors, there are youth groups that were all sponsored from different international, local organizations. And the propaganda was that Nigeria sponsored 1,004 or 1,000 and this to COP. That is a big lie. It is not, it can't happen in any country. When you look at, go and do the analysis, when one person going to COP is spending like 3 to 4 million naira on accommodation and tickets, now multiply that with 1,004 or 1,014 or so. Is that the way to run an economy that is going to look for financing? So I'm not speaking for the government, but I'm just saying that because of my experience in attending COP, anybody can attend COP based on your area of implementation. A musician can attend COP. Ghana always bring one musician, I've forgotten his name, he's a reggae musician. This man sing and talk about climate action. We even have the faith-based organization in COP that they are speaking on how to use their congregation to push the environment conversation. And look at it again, a country of 250 million people. You are comparing it with the country that is 3 million. With 3 million population, take 500 or 1,000 to COP. So when you are looking at a country like Nigeria, we have the private sector. I think the only thing that Nigerians need to ask is, who are those individuals? What is their contribution? Are they negotiators, or what are they doing on behalf of Nigeria? For civil society, we have been working on climate justice advocacy, speaking to different governments, bridging the intervention between the community and the government. And there are organizations that are being funded by international organizations, by different financial mechanisms, and then they need to report and present the outcome of their programs and projects. These people were not sponsored by the government. But when you look at the portal of the UN, it's written that they are from Nigeria. So we need to understand the concept and the idea of COP processes, and people should stop saying that, well, Nigeria, do you know, I will end with this. All 1,040 of it were not all the people that attended COP. Some of them had the accreditation on their data, the dashboard of UN, but unfortunately they couldn't get funding to go to COP at the end. Okay. How do you separate those people from the people that were counted in COP? And if you want to have the numbers of people that actually attend, then you need to go deeper by asking the UNFCCC, because the moment you sign up to enter the conference premises, it has shown that you've shown up. But on the database of the one that they are sharing up under are the numbers of delegations that apply for COP28.
Okay.
So we need that. Sorry, let me end. And government needs to also put a lot of orientation for people to understand the COP processes. Thank you.
Okay. Odirilwe, do you feel this way about the number of delegates sent by or the number of delegates from South Africa and the quality of the persons that were at COP28?
Right. So I must say I don't have the numbers, and so a few disclaimers is that I don't have the numbers. Mm-hmm. This was my first COP.
Oh, okay.
So to take Olumide's points, that I may be one of the people who doesn't understand how the process really works. Well, there are a few things I can say though. Maybe two things specifically I can say though, is that one is that for this participation in COP to be meaningful, to me it seems it will be important on the one side to have an Africa voice, And I say this because there is a lot of bilateral agreements that are being made that are in a way undercutting any position that Africa is taking as a unit. Because, show me the money, and so that tends to change the tune. So I think a stronger African voice is really critical for that attendance to be meaningful. In terms of the delegations of individual countries, this is a tricky one. So in the kinds of negotiations that I'm familiar with that are mainly to do with biodiversity the Intergovernmental Science Policy Department on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, typically what you see there, you see an underrepresentation of African countries in the negotiations and an overrepresentation of other countries.
Wow.
The negotiating people are backed by groups of researchers, scientists that are providing them with the underlying science to back up their negotiations. In a lot of cases, most of the African countries, at least in the platforms that I've been involved in, have very few people attending and not enough people backing them with the relevant science from the continent's perspective. So in that sense, we end up being... in some ways, I think people end up agreeing to things that are maybe not particularly context relevant in the best interest of the continent. So I think both having this unit of Africa as a unit represented there, and over time also developing a unit of scientists or researchers that are supporting this. For example, the African group of negotiators having being backed by groups of researchers that are really there for the science of the continent would be really, really critical going forward. Because I think in a lot of cases, you look at some of these agreements and you think, I'm not sure if we should be agreeing to this and not the other thing.
So this means you're also not against boycotting, future COP events.
So if you ask me about whether Africa should participate, I would say absolutely if they're happening, because we need to raise the voices of the context in those meetings. If you ask me whether COP should be happening itself, I'd say I'm not so convinced. but that's based on it might be unfair answer to this, but if I build on the experience of Olumide, I would say if it has to happen, it must happen less frequently. I'd say that.
Okay, that's no. It's only fine. We need diverse opinions, so we need to actually have diverse opinions and thought. So what should happen next? We're going into a new year, and what's next? What should be done? What next steps should be taken? Should we be taking Odirilwe? And in terms of preserving Africa's biodiversity, how should we approach it in the coming year?
Right. This is a really critical question and a complex one, for several reasons. One is because Africa has still a lot of unique biodiversity that's fairly intact compared to other places. So it's people want it because it's beautiful. We want to see it. People want it because they want to privatize it. People want it because there might be minerals under it. So there's a lot of competing interests. So if you look at there's a data set that somebody released, I think last year, about the big development corridors of Africa, the mega development corridors of Africa. And you can see a lot of the developments that are planned that are overlapping with a lot of this critical biodiversity itself. But the other side of our biodiversity that's both unique and also complex is that it is providing a lot of resources, basic material needs for people on the continent. So it's a source of jobs. For example, if I give an example in South Africa, biodiversity-related jobs are as much as mining jobs, although mining is always propped as a sector that's providing jobs. We're getting the same amount of jobs from biodiversity. So across the continent, people have livelihoods linked to biodiversity, have energy needs that are supplied by nature, because in most cases our countries or our governments are not able to supply the services we need. They should be, but they're not. In the meantime, people are relying on the local environment for a variety of resources that are important for their daily needs. So for this reason, I think the motivation to protect biodiversity is not so difficult here. and it's not about the whales, as one of the panelists mentioned. It's really, biodiversity is more than just the whales. It's about jobs. It's about medicines. It's about livelihoods. So we don't have to convince people in a rural area that it's important to have the local environment that they're using on a daily basis, as long as it's not presented as the way that it's putting fences around it in a way that limits their access. So I think that's the approach of putting fences around biodiversity and telling people they can't access it. I think in my opinion, that's the wrong approach, because it alienates people, and people see it as something for other people and not for themselves, even if it's something they're using already. So I think a critical aspect of biodiversity conservation on the continent will be critically to acknowledge the use of that biodiversity on the continent, and to design strategies that allow for the sustainable use of biodiversity.
Olumide, what's next for you in terms of the activism? What next steps are you taking? What's next? What next steps should we all be taking in the new year as we approach the climate conversation from different areas?
Thank you very much. I think as an organization, civil society, as an advocate, we need to intensify efforts in creating more awareness on the need for climate finance. We need to create more awareness on the outcome of the global stocktake. We need to look at how can we raise more voices in strengthening adaptation actions. It's very, very key. And how do we make sure that the so-called fund is operationalized for loss and damage? We need to increase that voice day in, day out. We need to start looking at, is our energy transition, is it just, or we are just playing around? So we need to look at just energy transition as a very strong issue to take further. And we are just talking about how do we grant African citizens their special needs? How do we make all these circumstances start to change? It might not change immediately, but how do we make our government accountable for their negotiation that will help the vulnerable people to be able to develop and have another, challenges that can help them to move further, to promote innovative ideas and to build resilience. And that's what I think in the coming year we should be focusing more on that, so that all of us will be able to see an outcome that can reflect in people and on the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful conversation with both of you. I really appreciate you taking out some time for this conversation. And to everyone who's listened, you can drop your comments, and you can also reach out to or follow both Olumide and Odirilwe. Olumide Idowu is a Nigerian climate change activist and the founder of International Climate Change Development Initiative. It's an NGO. And Odirilwe Selomane is a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria, Department of Agric Economic Extension and Rural Development. Thank you, Olumide, for your time.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Odiri, for your time as well. And I hope to see us moving further in building resilience across Africa. Thank you so much.
Odirilwe, thank you very much.
Anthony, and thanks to both of you. My last statement would be to say we need to keep working hard to represent African voices in this global negotiations, and we need to involve the private sector in raising the funding that we need to get those efforts going. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.